All right, everyone, welcome back. I hope that recorded. Welcome back, everyone. We move right along into chapter 12 today. So, yeah, population growth. So we're jumping into the back of the book. For those of you who have the books, I think everybody's starting to get their materials. It looks like a lot of people are figuring out how to work MindTap. It's fairly self-explanatory. Once you get on there, as I said, I think things are starting to fall into place. So, other thing that I did want to say is the packback discussions have been very good. I've really enjoyed reading those. Same thing with the MindTap exercises, those of you who have done it so far. I remember you have until Friday to do the first one, then they'll go back to being due on Wednesdays. So anyway, I will also be introducing the TAs, or at least they're adding them to the syllabus and talking about their roles next week. All right, so today as I said, we're jumping into the back of the book, into population growth and the elderly. Then we look at the environment and science and technology. So these are some big topics right now. So we're moving from a focus on some of these theories that we talked about earlier, such as Hayek and libertarianism, where they're competing different ideas of what justice is, where individual rights and social obligations cross, that sort of thing. Hayek famously has this quote: "The idea of social justice is that the state should treat different people unequally in order to make them equal." He was not a fan of social welfare type programs. That's sort of in contrast to John Rawls, who we talked about, who, he has that veil of ignorance experiment. A just society is a society that if you knew everything about it, you'd be willing to enter that place. You would be willing to enter it in a random place. If you remember, he had that quote about saying, there's nothing that's unjust, there's nothing that's unjust about the, natural distribution of our abilities, for example, for our mental, physical abilities and so on. It's how institutions sort of deal with that, the way we are and so on. And that actually, Darwin felt similarly. He said, "If the misery of the poor be caused not by the laws of nature, but by our institutions, great is our sin." And he tended to believe that our institutions were this kind of, long-term sort of evolution, but he was rather coy about talking about humans and evolution. Then when we talked about Eleanor Ostrom and her challenge to Garrett Hardin's idea of the tragedy of the commons, where he and others sometimes believe that basically humans will just, consume resources until they're gone. And Ostrom and others said, no, if you look historically, people do figure out ways of managing the commons and resources. And so Ostrom was the first woman who won the Nobel Economic Prize. And as I said, she did a lot of work looking at sort of decision-making that people would engage in. So we move then from looking at some of these more kind of broader theories to looking at issues. And, we'll see as we move along too, and I'll try to keep my slides as updated as possible. Coronavirus is just, it's like a hurricane through all these issues that we're talking about. You can look at the textbook and, imagine a hurricane just like going through all these topics: science, technology, the elderly, population, all these systems are being affected by coronavirus and, our response to it, and then so on. So as I said, we're moving now into talking about aging. And if you remember last time, I really wanted to emphasize that, we're moving in this direction where the world population is going to be is going to be older than it's ever been in terms of the average for the world, and especially for currently rich countries. You can see the population age 65 and over as percent of the population. This is basically where we're at now in 2020, and the forecast. High-income countries, by the time we get to the end of the century, roughly 30% of the population or more will be over the age of 65, and that's a huge level. Now, I do want to say, as just right off the bat, we know that coronavirus affects the elderly, generally affects the elderly more than younger people. We know that the elderly are at much greater risk, and there's been so many scary numbers. I'm only smiling because of a sort of pathological defense mechanism or something. The numbers, the trends, just being a sociologist, looking at some of these trends it's really depressing sometimes. So when we look at British care homes, like elderly homes in Britain, 1 out of 14 people there have died of COVID-19. That's almost 1 out of 10, and the numbers are accelerating based upon the new variant that they have there, which is quite frightening. It's taking over too. It seems to be the number one variant that's spreading across Europe. Denmark is sequencing the genomes of every coronavirus case. They have the ability to do that. And they're finding that 70% of them are this new variant that's been found in Britain. And we have the one in South Africa as well. So anyway, it's pretty alarming, and it's moving quite rapidly. In the United States, just this morning, like I said, I didn't have time to add it to the slide, but this morning, this report came out that, there's the state of New York, it sounds like they may have underreported the deaths in elderly homes by about 50%. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what one study is showing. And we know that it's high, and whether it's 50% or not, I don't know. So this is really, like I said, huge crisis. The elderly around the world are already suffering in nursing homes from isolation and depression, and this has only intensified with the pandemic, so we're going to need some long-term mental health care too. Just to jump I guess if you want to look at sort of the application of some of these theories, if like the closest you would come to, the closest we anywhere has come to a sort of libertarian society would be the United States. The closest thing that has come to a sort of John Rawls type society, Rawlsian society, would be the Nordic model, the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, and so on. Now, I have a lot of family in Denmark, and the thing is, so they have a very socialized economy in some areas, but not in all areas. So it's not like you go to Denmark and you go to a store and it's like the Danish government store and you have like Danish government tea and Danish water or whatever. No, you have the choice of the world's companies and so on and so forth. It's just that they do subsidize certain things such as education and healthcare. And we'll talk about healthcare in greater detail in the future. How do they achieve this? With higher tax rates. You have less concentration of the wealthy, but you do have more redistribution in society. So I have some relatives, for example, who are lawyers, fairly big kind of corporate labor lawyers, and then others who do something else I can't remember, but don't make as much money, nearly as much money as isn't are positions that are as prestigious. I can't remember what they are, obviously. And but the way their tax system is based, the lawyers, they do make better money, but it's not as dramatic as you would see in the United States or some other countries, many other countries actually. So the Scandinavian model sort of developed after the Second World War. along with a lot of other countries, Western Europe in general was able to build up this social welfare model. And the key thing to remember about this is that one reason they were able to do this is they didn't have to build up a military. This was the Cold War, and the United States, Europe was in ruins for the most part and divided essentially between the Soviet Union and the West United States. And the United States has more or less been protecting Europe from the Soviet Union and Russia, has since the end of the Cold War been trying to get Europe to pay for more of their defense systems. So I do want to just point that out that they don't have military. So if they had to grow militaries, then they would have to probably cut some of these programs or make other changes. But just something to think about. Now, again, the Scandinavian countries, they rank high in terms of business, a lot of business indicators in terms of where they stand in terms of the world, in terms of ease of doing business, global innovation, corruption perceptions, human development, prosperity. I mean, they always do very well in prosperity and happiness and so on. And some of that has to do with ethnic homogeneity. And we'll get to that when we talk about race and ethnicity later. But again, as I've said, it's kind of interesting because according to the World Value Survey, this big survey that's done, which looks at values in a lot of different countries, they find that the people in Scandinavian countries are some of the biggest believers in individual liberty, autonomy, that sort of thing. But they also have very big government and so on. So their view of the state is to promote individual autonomy and social mobility. They also have sort of a kind of community-oriented clinics and stuff. They're rooted to communities, and I think that's a key part that goes beyond just like race and ethnicity and stuff, and it goes really to the heart of sociological stuff, which is individual community, that sort of thing, which we kind of talked about. So kind of interesting. And I'm just talking about healthcare, just because as we're talking about the elderly in the context of the world we're in right now. Great Britain, they love their healthcare system, the National Health Service, which was built up in the aftermath of the Second World War. Things about Britain that British people are proud of, 54% the NHS, Armed Forces, 34%, Royal Family, 28%. Really kind of fascinating. When they had their 2012 Olympics opening ceremony, you should watch it if you can find it. They had a huge, kind of ceremony, and a whole bunch of it was, kind of venerating their NHS, their National Health Service system. So this isn't at a hospital. This is at the Olympics in 2012. You wouldn't find that people in America doing quite the same thing. Okay, now, so in terms of helping the elderly, how are the elderly helped, say in the United States? Well, I'll be focusing on the United States, but talking about other countries as well. In the United States, it was really the aftermath of the stock market crash and the Great Depression, and you get the development of Social Security in 1935. And this basically focused three systems. One, social insurance programs, such as Social Security. Two is public assistance, what we would think of as welfare, which we'll talk more about specifically later. And then three, health services, which became sort of like Medicare and Medicaid. So social insurance, this tends to be the government programs like Social Security. It can address unemployment as well as health issues and things like that. These tend to be the most popular social insurance program. Social programs that governments have tend to be ones that provide for the elderly when they retire. but not all countries have this. So when we look at the United States, looking at the percent of the US population that is 60 and 80, I mean, here you see the big change. 20% of the population is 60 or over, 4% is 80 or over. Get to 2050, 27% are going to be 60 or over, and 8% are going to be 80 and over. It doesn't seem like huge increases, but it actually is, because we're talking about tens of millions of people. And, that means big systems are changing. How are we going to accommodate all these people and so on? So I do want to introduce some theories too, regarding that the textbook lines out and that I'll sometimes bring into the lectures. These are more sort of analytical ways of understanding social problems. So functionalism is a school of thought in sociology that really tries to look at societies like ecosystems, tries to understand how systems function. So they look at the intended functions that, say education is supposed to have or healthcare is supposed to have versus the latent or unintended. So these could be the disparities in the quality, funding problems, that sort of thing. So there are always unintended consequences, and functionalists are always very interested in this. Conflict theorists, while everyone's sort of interested in how things function, conflict theorists tend to focus on different power, the different power statuses between groups and how this can lead to conflict. For example, starvation rarely occurs from just natural conditions, a drought. You don't get mass starvation, happening just because there's a drought. Famines are almost always the result of bad resource management. The famous economist, social scientist, Amartya Sen has done a lot of work in this area, looking at how people make choices, how famines are related to governments, and so on. Sorry, pour myself some tea. Hope I don't spill it all over my command center here. Okay. So anyway, and then the other sort of area of theory that will kind of, be looking at each issue through to understand it from a analytical perspective, not a moral perspective, kind of like we were talking about before. Symbolic interactionism seeks to understand how we understand what population growth means, or overpopulation, or what does it mean to be elderly. I've noticed that as we talk about COVID and young people, and they're saying COVID, young people under the age of 40, and I'm like, oh, I'm still young, fantastic. For so long it seemed like young people is really people under the age of like 25, and young people is under the age of 30, and now with coronavirus, they keep on reporting young people, under the age of 40. And I'm like, yeah, that's good. That sounds good. Okay. Yeah, I can get down with that now. I've got a cat who's trying to get my attention. Okay. Symbolic interaction also means that we see a growth in terms of ageism. So kind of like racism and sexism. Willow. I've got a cat. So we're seeing a growth in negative attitudes and prejudice towards people who are older. And I believe it was in Japan, I think, that there was actually a guy who went into an elderly home and started killing people because he was angry at these elderly people for using up all the world's resources or something like this. So there's a lot of attitudes like that, and you see it in the discussions of COVID. I mean, you've seen it so much in the discussions of COVID. So I mean, yeah, it's something that it's going to be a growing problem, I believe, especially as the greater proportion of the population becomes older. I mean, we have huge industries developed to make people look younger, but the reality is we have an aging population, and it's life is very challenging for them because, I mean, before the pandemic, especially, one of the things that I think was really interesting is if you go to like retail establishments, a lot of people working at the cash register are elderly. When I was younger, in high school and college, it was mainly, high school kids that you would see working at cash registers. You wouldn't see elderly people that often. That's changed. As the baby boomer, this huge generation has gotten older, there isn't enough social security necessarily for everyone. We don't have the greatest pension systems, which I'll talk about, and so on. So, there's been more elderly discrimination too. Elderly have had to work more than in the past, and there's more discrimination. The cost of living is going up. Many of the challenges that young people are facing, old people are facing as well. The big challenges I think facing the world, especially the rich world, are dementia. And as you see here, we're looking at the dementia forecast in terms of millions. For the middle income countries, they're going to be really taking off. For high income countries, they're going to be taking off as well. Low income countries, not as much because you don't have people living as long as in rich countries. But presumably, as people start living longer without cures for things like Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia, this is going to be one of the biggest problems we face in terms of a public health problem. You look at this is, the spending for long-term care as a percentage of a country's total GDP, the total amount that they spend, the total amount of their economic activity, and it's these are big percentages in a lot of countries that are in a lot of the rich countries, approaching 4% of GDP in the Netherlands. Again, it sounds like a small amount, but it's actually huge. It's a huge amount of money that needs to be spent. And the problem, the real problem, there's a couple problems. One problem is how, again, going back to symbolic interactionism, how we talk about this. So often when we talk about, caring for the elderly and all of this, we think in terms of money and like all this, trillions of dollars that we're going to need for, for based on current spending on the elderly and so on. But what people don't talk about as much are the workforce that's going to be needed. So we're looking at Alzheimer's, for example. In the United States, 2/3 of people with Alzheimer's are women, and 60% of caregivers for people at home are women. So we're looking at a huge amount of money that mostly families have to spend. In a sort of weird and sick irony of the world. I'm giving this lecture. I'm recording this lecture now. After I give it, I'm calling my mom to talk to her about the decision that her and my uncles have made regarding my grandmother, who is suffering from dementia, and they're making this decision like yesterday or today about putting her in a facility. And during COVID and everything. So it's just like, really, like the day that I'm giving a lecture on elderly and the dementia, my grandma's like, getting put in a home for dementia, like fun. I thought you thought I was going to say something else. Okay. So anyway, as I said, a lot of the people who are caring for the elderly, for people who are suffering from dementia, are women. And we're looking at 1/5 of the people in residential care homes right now in total have dementia. China has more people with dementia than any other country because it has more people than any other country. It includes Taiwan in its total, but so whatever. But anyway, India, as I said, will be probably accelerating past China in terms of its population size in the next few years or so. So since it has a lower oops, since it has a lower life expectancy than China, you see that there's a lower number of people with dementia, but it's probably there's probably underestimates happening. And again, the other places with big numbers are the rich places such as the EU, America, and Japan. When we look at Great Britain, and again, Great Britain's is going through a huge crisis right now. This was basically, this is looking at what's going on there now. So Great Britain is, England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. About 312,000 people are in care homes, and, a number expected to, rise quite high in the coming years. It was so bad that when COVID-19 started, basically 1 out of 4 hospital beds owned by the NHS had people with dementia in it. So 1 out of 4 hospital beds, not just not just residential care beds, but entire hospital beds. So the NHS right now, like many healthcare systems, are just getting overwhelmed, and they're bad political choice that were made early on, and they've been hit with this much more virulent and deadly strain. So, another place we talked about Japan last time, as there you have one of the world's oldest populations, and will continue to. Interesting. So, Japan, their population, as I said, they're going to be short of residential places for 140,000 people. They were just a couple of years ago, and they're getting hit with coronavirus as well. And so again, they're going to need a huge increase in their workforce, and so that would mean that on this basis, more than a tenth of Japan's workforce will be working as caregivers. That's really kind of incredible. Japan famously does not allow a lot of immigration. So in a lot of richer countries, it's a lot of immigrant labor that takes care of the elderly, that works in care facilities and so on, that works in home health care, that sort of thing. And domestic cleaning, and a whole range of ways that the elderly are helped. So Japan either is going to have to devote a huge proportion of its economy and workforce to helping the elderly, or are going to have to admit immigrant labor that is going to come in and do this, or change the economy completely and do something. I don't know. We're looking at some real big crises here. Japan is interesting too demographically. The roots of this we'll get into maybe a little bit later. So 1 out of 3 people in Japan in their early 30s, has never had sex. And so that's not a prescription for population growth. So anyway, as I said, we'll probably get into discussing that a little bit more later. I don't know if you can hear my cat. She's just like meowing at me from the other room. She can just walk in, but I don't know. Willow, come in. Okay, so moving into China then, looking at China's demographics. Hold on one. All right, everyone. I'm back. Willow's back for a moment. She just would not stop meowing. She just needs to be held sometimes. She's like a toddler or something. It's like a monkey, puppy, kitty toddler. Okay, I'm going to, hopefully she's... Oh, all right, now get serious. Okay, so talking about China. So most of the population in China, which has the world's largest population, lives in the eastern part of China. That's where a lot of the huge cities are, the huge factory systems and so on. And basically over the last 30 to 40 years, you've had that biggest migration in human history happen as people from the rural western parts of China have moved into the eastern parts of China to work in the cities. Now, we'll get into that in a little bit more. There's kind of a complex residential sort of system there, so it's not. There are a lot of people who are sort of like migrant workers who go to eastern China, but they aren't actually residents of those cities. They're still considered residents of their rural areas. So China, obviously, they have a huge population, and one of their biggest concerns has always been feeding that population. That's the concern of every country. That's the number one concern of every country is making sure the population is fed. So China, as its population was growing, became alarmed during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. At the rate at which it was happening, and they were worried about, running into that sort of Malthusian crisis. Then in 1979, they instituted the famous one-child policy, where basically, there were big fines that were levied on couples who had more than one child, other restrictions, that sort of thing. It wasn't consistently applied, so there were sort of exceptions sometimes because people are different, and it wasn't a uniform policy. In 2013, they sort of reduced. They made it more flexible. They removed some restrictions and so on. And one of the reasons was because they were starting to worry about this big elderly population that they have. 1 out of 4 people in China right now is around the age of 65 or older, and again, that's a huge population that's going to need care. Now, how are the elderly in China cared for? Well, it's different than the United States. Although you have this government that's more functionally modern and whatever, you still have a much more traditional sort of family system of taking care of the elderly. Oh, Willow, I've got to get a lecture. Okay. So, there's something called the Family Support Agreement, which is a voluntary contract between older parents and adult children that basically lays out details for how the adult children will provide parental care. This is, as I said, by 2050, we'll go from about 1 out of 4 to 1 out of 3 people in China being elderly. So there are a lot of challenges that China faces. So, and there are a lot of different views about the voluntary support agreements. A lot of people in China maybe who do not have good relations with their parents do not want to sign this sort of agreement with them. So there are a lot of things like that. France has a similar system, has something like that as well. Which I think I have a slide about. So you can see in China's the amount of their median age is going to go up more dramatically than in the United States. Again, this is looking at current trends based on immigration and so on. But you can kind of see where China's projected to be at, or at least this was before COVID. You see, they have a much larger elderly population in 2050 than they did in 2015. So that's going to transform China in the same way that will transform the United States and the European Union. In Singapore, okay, there we go. Okay, in Singapore, you have the Maintenance of Parents Act of 1995. Basically made it so that parents could sue their children who failed to support them. There's something similar under French law where basically, some children are obligated to honor and respect their parents, pay a certain amount in allowance or something, and basically are expected to provide some amount of care for the elderly. Something to think about. Do you think that adult children should be required to care for their aging parents? Because the problem is otherwise, well, here, look at it this way. Okay, so throughout most of history, the elderly have been cared for by the family. We see that still in a lot of Asian countries, in a lot of European countries, but you have a more social welfare system like that, and in the United States with Social Security. So a lot of workers in the United States are worried that they don't have enough money to live comfortably in retirement. And these are numbers from before the COVID pandemic, before the current economic crisis. So we're looking at probably a big drop in living standards in the United States in the years ahead. Not for everyone, but for larger segments of the population than we're certainly used to. So when we look at old age poverty later on in life, you can see kind of where different countries are. South Korea, it has higher poverty rates for the elderly. Interestingly, you also have higher suicide rates in South Korea, and those suicide rates are highest amongst that population, amongst the elderly. I think if you're in my SOC 1, if you're in my Intro to SOC class, I talked about that in another class. Okay. The OECD, just get used to thinking of that as rich countries, primarily Western Europe, parts of East Asia, and so on, the United States. A number of rich countries. So that's kind of a good average in terms of seeing, okay, what's going on with the rich world. So as I said, one of the other ways beyond Social Security that's paid out is this pension. I mean, in some ways, the pension is Social Security as a kind of pension, but most pensions are a amount that's paid to an individual when they retire. Most pensions are now invested in markets, it's a big gamble. It's something that, if you have, this isn't on right now, this isn't current, but, if you have time, it's probably not something you're really interested in right now. But the pension system will be it's a huge part of the economy, of society. I need to move on these slides. Okay. Traditional pensions are called defined benefit. Basically, retirees receive a specific annual amount until their death. There aren't very many companies or institutions that offer defined benefit plans anymore. What you see more often is a defined contribution plan, such as what we have at Penn, or I have at Penn State. You can get a defined benefit for complex reasons. I have a defined contribution. I might prefer a defined, anyway, complex reasons I won't go into right now. Anyway, so defined contribution means that your retirement plans are invested into the market, which also means though that they rise with the market, but they also fall with the market. So as I said, Social Security becomes kind of the main way in which a lot of people in the United States are paid for. The slides are on there. You can look at those more closely. But Social Security, as we talked about, began in 1935, and it's kind of expanded over time a bit, especially in the 1960s. And the big question is there a Social Security crisis? Depends on who you ask. Probably. I would say that there's probably a Social Security crisis linked to a number of other crises. The real problem isn't so much Social Security, is that our society just doesn't, it's Social Security is just a financial measure, to me at least, as a sociologist, is a financial measure of this bigger looming problem of actual old people and actual workers who need to care for them, as I was just discussing. So economically, financially, Social Security, depending on how you did the tax system and how the economy is doing, that determines whether or not Social Security is in a crisis, more than anything else. In the United States, again, one of the reasons that the United States Social Security is actually probably more secure than some social welfare systems is because of its immigrant society, because you have the younger workers who are coming in and paying into Social Security, including a lot of people who are not citizens, who are working here, who are actually still some of their paycheck goes into paying Social Security that they will probably not actually receive because they are not citizens. So one of the things, the pension funds, these are huge amounts of money now that are go into hedge funds. One of the biggest, money vehicles in the world is CalPERS. CalPERS is the California state pension system. So, California is, like the fifth biggest economy in the world if it was a country. So its public pension system is enormous. We're talking about a huge amount of money. So here's the problem, though. So the fund value back in 1999, they're looking at growth rates, what they were projecting, what they're projecting they need, by around, 2016 or so, what they were thinking back in the 1990s or so. But then you get a recession in 2000, then boom, you get 2008 recession there. And I lived in California through actually most of this time period until about 2015. I spent that whole recession in California, which was a very interesting place. And I wrote a book about housing and stuff, probably. But now, I don't know what it looks like now, but, I'm sure it's taken another hit. So that's worrisome. What about a little bit closer to where we are, at least some of us are now? Pennsylvania, here's its pension debt. This is out of date by whatever, a month or a semester, I guess, out of date. But there's this Pennsylvania pension debt clock that's kind of always adding up how much money is going to be needed to pay out the pension fund. Say if everyone retired and they needed to pay out everybody's pensions, like how far are people behind? How far are states behind and organizations? And you see they're pretty far behind. So this is public sector pension schemes by percentage funded by roughly 2018. So Chicago police, 25% funded. Chicago municipal, so basically all Chicago workers, municipal workers, about the same 25%. New Jersey teachers, about 42%. Philadelphia municipal, about 45%. So in other words, they are not fully funded. So this is going to be a big problem in some of these states. So we're already seeing a lot of these problems break out between sort of my generation and I guess I'm not sure. I'm kind of an elder millennial or a very young Generation X. I'm sort of born in the early 1980s, in between there. There's kind of a battle going on between the baby boomers and the millennials. Then you got Generation X, who are, kind of born in the, after the baby boomers in the 70s and primarily the 70s, late 60s, 70s, maybe early 80s. Gen Z, that's supposed to be you're just coming into the world and you're getting quite a treat, dose of hard reality, I think a much more harsher dose of reality than I think both the baby boomers and the millennials have received. With my friends and colleagues, we often talk about how would we act when we were your age, with everything going on right now, the pandemic and all the political strife and so on and so forth. So anyway, we'll get there. So the thing to keep in mind is that, all this stuff may seem way off in the future, that, you don't have to really be too concerned with it. But, it's not going to be too long before you're in the sandwich generation. And, I think it's something that's really stressing a lot of people out in their middle ages, and especially as we have COVID too. And again, that's going to be, as we move into these topics, COVID is going to be a part of it, because it's it's a transformative event that is really, causing, wreaking havoc across the world's social systems. So as I said, I'll try to update, the data as much as possible as COVID relates to it. But things are happening very quickly. So, okay, I'll end it there. Next week we get into the environment, more topics of harsh realities and so on. Okay, all right, everyone. Well, have a good weekend at Penn State. Try to stay warm if you're in the cold areas around Penn State. If you're in other parts of the world, sunnier parts, I hope you can get some sun and not get sick. All right.